Dear friend, brother and colleague, Victor to speak. Victor.
Good evening and thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank Michel for being here today, and especially Eugene Cotran for stepping in at the last minute for Professor Massih who can't make it today. I'd also like to thank Klug, who was very kind to read over parts of my manuscript and offered me very good advice. In addition, I'd like to thank Sharif at Arab Media Watch and Chris Doyle at Kabu for organising this event. I initially first came up with the idea of writing a book when I was working with Sharif at Arab Media Watch several years ago, and the initial idea was to write a basic guide for journalists explaining the legal issues behind the conflict. But when I approached some publishers to see if they were interested, they told me there wasn't a big market just for journalists, so I better had broaden it to appeal to a wider audience. So I ended up writing a more an overview of the conflict, and in the end I wrote a history, which wasn't what I ended up initially intended to do. And one of the reasons I wrote this, I focused on the history, was I always wanted to know why did this conflict start, and I wasn't impressed with some of the current books that are out there, especially legal books. I mean, there hasn't been a good book on the Palestine question written by a Palestinian for about 30 years, and the last great scholar was someone called Henry Kattan, who's no relation of mine, and he published several books on Jerusalem, on the Palestine question, in the 1960s and early 1970s, some of which are still in print to this day. But when Henry was writing on the conflict, he didn't have access to the archival documents in the National Archives because of the 30-year and 50-year rule. So when I decided to go and write this book, I of course had all these documents available, and I made good use of them. And I'd like to start by touching on a correspondence which proved to be very contentious and controversial throughout the Mandate years, and that was called the Hussein McMahon correspondence, which was a series of letters exchanged between Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British High Commissioner in Cairo, and the Sheriff of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, in 1915. This was 2 years before the Balfour Declaration was issued, and it was during the First World War. And essentially, the Sheriff of Mecca wanted to break away from the Ottoman Empire and secede, and he wanted British support in order to do this. And so he was sounding out to see if there's anyone who'd like to join him to fight the Turks. But in exchange for his support, he wanted Britain to promise certain territories in exchange for Arab independence. And initially Britain was lukewarm to the idea. However, there were about 7 or 8 letters exchanged. In the end, they went along with this, and there was this big campaign. You had Lawrence of Arabia and Lord Allenby eventually walked through into Jerusalem and Damascus. You've probably seen the film Lawrence of Arabia. But the biggest controversy was over whether Palestine was included in this pledge to Hussein ibn Ali, whether the British government had promised Palestine to be part of the independent Arab state. And a lot of historians have taken different sides on this view. Usually, if you support the Israeli side, you say it didn't include Palestine, and if you're on the Palestinian side, you'll say that it did. But no one's ever looked at it from a legal perspective or revisited the correspondence in the archives, which I've done. And what I discovered was extremely interesting. I found documents from the Political Intelligence Department at the Foreign Office making it very clear that Palestine was included in the pledge. I even came across this map, which you might be wondering what it is, but this is a Foreign Office cartographer who's asked to take a red pen and go around all the areas which had been promised to Hussein ibn Ali in the correspondence, and it's quite clear, I don't know how good your geography is, that Palestine is included in that pledge, and the blue area approximates to Lebanon and northern Syria. So I thought that was quite damning evidence. You have a map by the Foreign Office, you have documents by the Foreign Office all saying that, yes, Palestine was included in that pledge. So the next question one asks oneself is, what happened? Why did 2 years later the British government essentially promised Palestine to another people? So Palestine became the twice promised land in the Balfour Declaration. And again, I wasn't too impressed with some of the legal analysis of the Balfour Declaration, because it kind of just focuses on the wording and the words without looking at the players behind the exchange of correspondence. And so I took a closer look at Arthur Balfour's background. Arthur Balfour was Foreign Secretary, and the letters named after him. And I discovered a lot of links, but tracing it much further back into time, to the early 20th century, to the time when he was the Prime Minister of this country. And it was under his tenure that the British Parliament passed something called the Aliens Act in 1905, which effectively restricted Jewish immigration into Britain. And I then discovered something called the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration, which was published 2 years before then, in 1903. And the minutes of that commission are this huge document, very dusty, in the archives of the London School of Economics in the basement. And as I was going through the minutes, I was looking at who gave oral evidence before the commission, and two names kind of popped out to me, and I thought, bingo. And these names were Dr. Theodor Herzl and Dr. Adolf Bohm, who were both prominent leaders of the Zionist movement. So I just thought I'd better go and take a look at what they were saying. And in short, what Theodor Herzl was saying, he was basically summarizing his book, The Jewish State, and he was basically just trying to suggest to the British government that support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine was one way of solving Britain's immigration problem. On the Royal Commission was someone called Lord Rothschild, who was the addressee of the Balfour Declaration. It begins by saying, "My dear Lord Rothschild," and it's signed by Balfour. So I found all these connections between the idea of a Jewish homeland as a solution to what people call the Jewish question. And I looked at the diaries of Theodor Herzl, and I looked at the debates over the Uganda plan, which some of you may have heard of. There's this idea of creating a Jewish homeland in Uganda. Various other places were looked at, including the Sinai, Cyprus, Congo, Argentina. But the Uganda plan was it was called the Jewish Colonization Scheme for East Africa. And when I saw who drafted it, again, it was another, it was drafted by David Lloyd George, who some of you realize became British Prime Minister in 1916. So I was able to link the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Rothschild and Herzl, all to this idea. And so I started to look at, to see if this idea of Jewish immigration and the Jewish question and homeland in Palestine was linked, whether they followed up in later years. And I found correspondence between Nahum Sokolow, who was the chairman of the World Zionist Organization, and Lord Robert Cecil. And then I found a very interesting correspondence between Justice Louis Brandeis of the US Supreme Court and Foreign Secretary Balfour in 1919, saying exactly the same thing. And essentially what I argue in the book is that the Balfour Declaration should be seen as, it served two interests. One was imperial and one was also linked to the policy of immigration. And the reason why Britain couldn't offer such a declaration in 1903 or in 1905 or until 1917, because Britain was not in control of Palestine. But in November 1917, Britain was on the verge of conquering Palestine from the Turks, and 2 weeks later Lord Allenby marched into Jerusalem. And of course, once Britain had control of Palestine, they could issue such a declaration. But the Balfour Declaration contained two safeguard clauses, one protecting Jewish rights and the other protecting Arab rights. The clause protecting